There we go. Hi there, everybody. Welcome to a special bonus episode of the Hugo's There podcast, where I'm going to be talking about some of the short fiction nominees with a panel of awesome people, internet friends, new and old. And we're starting off with the short stories. And so I've assembled a pretty big panel here today. And I want to go through and introduce the new faces who haven't been on these before first, and then we'll talk to everybody else as well. So I'll call your name and just go ahead and introduce yourself, who you are, where you're from, any vital statistics people need to know about. Just a kind of a quick intro, and we'll start with Anne.
Starting with whom?
Starting with Anne.
Hi, I'm Anne Spangler of the Hugo and Nebula podcast, readership podcast. I'm kind of new to the Zoom thing, so forgive me if I'm slow on the button. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Okay, why don't we go ahead and go to Rob next?
Okay, my name's Rob Tomshani, and I'm in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and just kind of wandered in here from Twitter, more or less, and Seth was gracious enough to let me in on this. So I, even when I don't get to Worldcon or get a membership, I still try to keep up with the Hugos, and this year I'm a voting member, but probably won't get to the con. But as I said, it'll be nice to participate in the discussion here as
cool.
A little compensation.
It's good to have you. Thanks for being here. And then Amanda.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Walkeruk, and my partner Ivor Watkins and I co-edit, co-write, co-manage, co-dishwasher, handy person, the unofficial Hugo Book Club blog, which we're very excited is on the Best Fanzine nominee, ballot for this year's Hugo Awards. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. This is awesome. Okay, so then other faces I think we've at least had on the podcast, but maybe not on one of these video episodes. Lisa, you've been on the podcast, but not on one of these.
Yes. Hi, I'm Lisa McCarty. I'm from the Boston area. About a year ago, I joined the team of Narrated, which is a podcast about audiobooks that's been going on for about 4 years. We don't review exclusively sci-fi and fantasy, but we lean that way. And we have quite a bit of Hugo coverage. So we have episodes this year on the novella, novel, and series nominees, and we're working on a Lodestar episode.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks for being here.
Thanks
okay, and then people that we've seen here before, I'll start at the top on my screen with one.
And of course, Alt Day doesn't work as expected. Hi, Juan San Miguel, longtime Worldcon attendee, and right now guesting on many podcasts, master of none, and just checking out the short story nominees.
Cool. All right, JW.
JW Wartick, mostly just some guy on Twitter at JW Wartick, and I run a blog, Eclectic Theist, which I have a lot of fun writing about sci-fi. I've been reading every Hugo Award nominee, starting at the front for Best Novel, and I have about 10 left since 1956 or whatever year, so I'm almost done with all of them. So really excited to be here with the short stories, because not a format I always read. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Previous guest on the podcast. And then Lori.
Hey, I am Lori Anderson. I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm one of the 3 co-hosts of the Hugo Girl podcast. And I'm excited to be back on and join you for another panel today. So thanks for having us.
Yeah, that's great. So maybe you go to Haley next, your co-host.
Hey, y'all. This is Haley from Hugo Girl. I'm also in Atlanta and super stoked to be here.
Cool. Thanks for being here again. And Ivor.
Greetings from the central belt of Scotland, where we await summer one day, if it comes. I'm just my pleasure. I'm just a reader. I'm not nothing to plug. The only vital statistic is that at least 4 of my cats will make an appearance during this, because obviously I'm now working at my desk, so they have to come through.
Right.
Just a reader, just enjoying short stories. Loved it the last time. I'll love it this time. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Good to have you. Okay, Sarah.
Hey, I'm Sarah Elkins. I'm in the DC area. You can find me on Twitter as @configures, where I tweet about DevOps and science fiction and some social things and other stuff. Hey.
Cool. All right, last but not least, Cora.
I'm Cora Bulat. I'm from Bremen in North Germany. I'm a writer, teacher, translator, and also blog a lot about science fiction, fantasy, and related subject. And I'm also a 3-time Hugo finalist for Best Fan Writer.
Nice.
And I'm really happy to be here again, and because I enjoyed it a lot last year.
Yeah, it was great last year. So looking forward to doing this. I'm definitely going to plan to do one of these for novelettes. I didn't get to novellas last year. I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to do it because I've got some vacation. We've got some travel coming up. Might try and do like a last minute one right before the voting deadline. So stay tuned for that. With that said, let's go ahead and talk about the actual stories. I'll read through the list of them and then we will start talking through them in that order. So we have Mr. Death by Alix E. Harrow, which was published in Apex. Then we have Proof by Induction by José Pablo Iriarte from Uncanny. The Sin of America by Catherynne and Valente from Uncanny as well. Tangles by Seanan and McGuire from magicthegathering.com, which is interesting to me. Unknown Number by Blue Neustifter. I'm not sure how German I should pronounce that name. Cora, you can tell me how you would pronounce it.
Well, I would pronounce it Neustifter.
Okay.
I don't know actually how Blue herself prefers it.
Yeah.
I'll ask. She's quite active on Twitter, and
okay.
I think you can ask her there.
Nice. And then we have Where Oaken Hearts Do Gather by Sarah Pinsker, also from Uncanny. Uncanny is almost running this category this year, kind of as it has been the last few years. So let's go ahead and go through in that order. We do have one person kind of set up as the kind of recapper and person to kick off the conversation. But like I told everybody before we started, I'm not going to limit it to just one person talking about it. We'll just kind of talk until it comes to a natural settling point and we'll move on to the next one. So let's start with Mr. Death, and Amanda, I have you down for the recap or
thank
kick
you.
off the conversation.
Well, Mr. Death is about the importance of finding a job with a good emotional fit and how the right job and the right boss can help you work through and live with your own emotional baggage. Now, the story itself is about a reaper, so someone who's died and is tasked with the job of helping others find their way to the next thing. And in this story, the next thing is joining the limitless love of the universe. Now, the first person exposition in this story, in my opinion, is perfectly executed. From the first sentence, the reader knows that this is about reaping and that it's going to get super emotional, super fast. And you feel connected right away to the protagonist, Sam, which is kind of odd for me because Sam is a middle-aged white guy who died from lung cancer about 15 years after the death of his young son. So that's some good writing. Sam basically smoked himself to death while trying to cope with the death of his son. And that's the type of emotional angst that qualifies him for the job of being a reaper. And Alix Harrow makes sure that we as the reader really feel the emotional pain of both Sam losing his child and the tension that this emotional state creates when Sam is tasked with assisting the after-death journey of a 2-year-old boy named Lawrence. So Sam struggling with the Lawrence job it provides the reader with that much needed, complication to get into the dramatic story arc. And he gets to do things that you wouldn't expect. Like Sam and Lawrence actually play together. They play ball. Sam meddles a lot more than he should in Lawrence's life, which allows Lawrence to cheat death for a little bit and gets Sam in big trouble with his boss to the point where he's really worried about being completely terminated, if you know what I mean. But the boss, Raz, is benevolent and gives Sam another chance. And even though Raz doesn't get a lot of story time, the character description is strong enough for us to both respect what she has to do and also feel her compassion for the role of the Reaper and even lead us to wonder about her decision-making process. And I think that's really strong in a short story to have us have the reader wondering what's the decision, what's going to happen, will she give Sam another chance or has he screwed up a little too much? So anyways, Raz does give Sam the chance to hand off the Lawrence file, kind of a nice exit strategy there, but Sam chooses to try again. He chooses to face his emotional complications and baggage and try again. So we, as a reader, feel that opportunity for character transformation, which is key, in my opinion, to any good and successful story. But in the end, Sam stays true to his own emotional complexity and fails pretty big time at the job. And then there's a satisfying twist at the end. But all in all, this was just a really enjoyable story, and I think it was really well executed with great pacing, appropriate flashbacks, and ends with hope, which for a story about death and losing a child, just really impressed with how Alix Harrow pulled this one off.
Cool. I think you have set a very high bar.
It's my first time.
All right. So anybody else want to talk about this one? Go ahead, Cora.
Well, I enjoyed this one a lot. Actually, this was the second. I always keep a sort of list spreadsheet of stories I want to nominate that are potential Hugo nominees, as I call them. And this was the second story I put on that list in early. It came out fairly early in 2021, and this was actually the second story I put on the list. The first one was a novelette which sadly did not make it. But yes, I was really impressed by this story. And when I reread it again for this panel, yes, it's as Amanda says, they make Alix Harrow does a great job to make us emotionally connect, not just to Sam, who's not all that well. I mean, we feel sorry for him, of course, because he's a bereaved father, but he's not all that likable. He's a middle-aged guy who smoked himself to death. And also, she also makes us feel for Lawrence. Lawrence is a 2-year-old boy. Of course, everybody feels for 2-year-old children who are about to die from an undiagnosed heart defect. But Lawrence is not just, it's a cute 2-year-old. He's an actual personality. We get a lot of personality from Lawrence. And what's interesting is people sometimes sense reapers, but they normally can't see them. But small children sometimes can. And Lawrence can see Sam and, well, thinks of him as, he's got a new imaginary friend, a sad man. This is actually what he tells his mother at one point. And another thing I found really well done is that we get from just a bit of description that the parents of Lawrence the family is poor. They're poor. They live in a trailer and they apparently don't have a lot of money, which is probably also because they live in the US, why the heart defect, which would have killed Lawrence, is not diagnosed in time. And well, it's a lovely story. It makes me. I'm not someone who really gets a lot very emotional stories, but on whom emotional manipulation works. But it works in this story, and I enjoyed it a whole lot.
Nice. Go ahead, Juan.
Yeah, no. So I can bring a little context into it. I've been a fan of Alix Harrow ever since she did the story which she won her first Hugo, Witch's Guide to Escape, a practical compendium of portal fantasies. I just thought was dynamite. So I think, and I'm looking at her bibliography right now, and I think, well, I've covered most of this. I've read all of the stuff except for one story where she's won an award. I'm a big fan of Death from Sandman, so you're always trying to look for a new angle about Grim Reaper stories, and she brought it. I mean, it was, there were a lot of surprises in it. Obviously, it's very emotional, as Cora's described, and it just gets you. I think it's also an audio story because I sometimes I'll remember a story because I was walking my dog when I was listening to it, and I think it made the Uncanny podcast. So if anybody hasn't heard it, you can check it out real quick.
Nice. Lisa, why don't you go ahead and go next?
Sure. I think Amanda did a great job summarizing, so I don't have a whole lot to add, but I wanted to say that I also loved this one and really felt that it worked on an emotional level. I have a really hard time with the death of young children in stories. It took me months to pick up the 5th season again after the opening scene.
Oof, yeah.
And so when I looked like the story was going in that direction, I was worried about it. And it is, as Amanda said, it manages to be hopeful while still, you know, not shying away from the difficulties. So.
Yeah.
Sorry, I know we're supposed to jump in next. So
Go for it.
for me, the scene that really struck me was when he's standing there over the kid as he's watching the mom tuck him in for what should be the last time, you know, and it's kind of like wants to like grab her and be like, hey, like pinch his cheeks, like say you love him, like do more than just like because right now, like I have young children, and with the state that we are in the United States, whenever I drop them off at school or daycare, I just think like I want this could be the last conversation I have with them. Like, and that's a real thing. And
Yeah.
so I was trying to make sure like it's not just a pedantic like pat on the head, have a good day, because it's like, what would my last words be to my own child? And
Yeah.
so that scene just really, really struck me hard. And Harrow is just a phenomenal author. I mean, her writing style is just so great. Her voice from first person perspective just works so well. I was immediately just engrossed. So I loved this one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was gonna jump onto that exact same point. JW is, you know, I'm the parent of an adult son at this point, but I remember back to when he was little, and you think that you're cherishing every moment, but really you get into a routine and you start getting to where things are just kind of by rote. And, you know, even saying I love you to someone, you can just kind of be out of habit. And so the idea of what would those last words be to someone if they were to suddenly die, and just the way he has a knowledge of the future, and you know, knows this is the last time you're going to tuck him in. And if you knew that, what would you change? Rob, why don't you go ahead and go next?
Okay, yeah. I just kind of want to, in talking about this, I just wanted to make some comparison with some of the other stories. I'll go into more detail later on when we get to those stories. But just my own experience when I started reading the Hugo stories, the first one I read, or really reread, was the Unknown Number story. And I thought, wow, this is pretty emotional. This is going to be hard to beat. And then the next one I read was the Iriarte story with the mathematician and his recently deceased father, and it's not exactly like any relationship I've had, but similar enough. I thought, ooh, this is deep. And then the next one I come to is Mr. Death with children in peril, and I'm going, oh hell no. So it's like, I really am going to have to read these again to make a judgment on how I want to put them on the preference ballot, because this is all such a powerful group overall, and the others are terrific too. But I just wanted to highlight those three, you know, and with this one, and anyway, that's pretty much it for now.
By the way, I didn't say at the top for anybody listening to this, obviously these are short stories, and so we're going to go full spoilers. You know, if you don't want to be spoiled, I think these are all available online to read. So do make sure you check that out. And I'll try and put links in the video notes and the show notes for the podcast as well. So don't be spoiled unnecessarily here. I did think it was really interesting, this one, where it essentially, like, you have this person being, you know, trained as a reaper, but at the end it's like, oh no, you were actually training as a guardian angel. And it was a nice little twist at the end there. Sorry, so that's the spoiler. It does make you wonder, you know, about some of the cosmology of it. You know, at some point wouldn't he question, well, where was the guardian angel for my child? But you always get into that kind of theodicy question. Go ahead, Lori.
Yeah, I love this story, but that's actually my one complaint about it. Or I don't even know if a complaint is the right word, but when I did get to the end of it, I thought, well, why don't all children get a guardian angel? And I think she tried to address that a little bit, because Raz says that his son, I think, died in a car crash, and so he didn't have time to react the way that our narrator does with Lawrence. But yeah, I certainly had that thought too, because there are, you know, plenty of losses that could have been prevented if you had a guardian angel intervene like Sam does. So I wondered about that. It doesn't really take away from the story for me, because I do think otherwise it's so good and so moving. But I had that same reaction to it.
Yeah, part of it, I think, is you can take into the, like, what benefit comes from suffering, and the benefit here comes from his suffering led him to be more compassionate to lead him into this role, right? Ivor, go ahead.
Just a couple of things from my side. First of all, there's a great deal of humor in this. Unfortunately, there is humor in death. And I'll come to that just in a second. And I do like the line that says, he looked out the window to see Raz standing in the yard like the end of times, like vengeance in the cable knit sweater. I hope it is. No smocks or canes or like that, just basically cable knit sweaters, and everyone happy. But I worked in healthcare for the past 30 years. So I've been in and out of hospitals, and I like to think from the writer's side as to where maybe they got these inspirations. And I could probably understand if you were looking at the corridor in a hospital where there's a lot of pain, suffering, illness, and curing, etc. Maybe there are other ethereal elements to it, walking along, waiting to find either their companion to be, or waiting to provide life. I don't know. I don't have any faith in that way, but it's a great idea as a writer. What else is there that you can't see?
Yeah. Juan, go ahead.
It's interesting you guys were mentioning guardian angels. When I read it, I thought it was something else. I mean, it's like he's gone to something else, and since obviously it didn't explicitly say angel, I just said some other type of celestial being. So it just kind of slipped to me. So those questions that you guys were asking didn't occur to me because I thought it was actually something else. I thought that might bring up if other people feel that way.
It's definitely left ambiguous, right? It doesn't say that. It just says that Lawrence is no longer belongs to the Ministry of Death or something like that. So.
Oh, and just one more thing, and I'll leave it at that. I think one of the things I did like about it is it's kind of treated as a job. It's it's kind of it's not special or divine. It's just a day in and day out job with its ups and its downs. And I think that was that's why when he becomes something else, I see that as become another kind of job.
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit of On a Pale Horse by Pierce Anthony. Go ahead, Lisa.
I just wanted to say the word angel wasn't there, but it did say guardian.
Okay.
So yeah, it was like assistant guardian or guardian in training or something like that. So for the Ministry of Life.
Yeah.
Or
Department of Life.
Department of Life. Yeah. So it was not. Yeah. So that I think you were right on that guardian angel was implied.
Yeah. I just noticed that the purple lightsaber has transitioned to red for some reason. Any other comments about this? Okay. We can move on to another one. So for the next one, we have proof by induction, and JW, you are going to lead that discussion.
Yeah, so the elevator pitch for proof by induction is that Polly is a mathematician, mathematics professor, struggling to get tenure and trying to find space to get published and things, and his dad dies. His dad was also a mathematician, and that becomes important because they've developed this technology where they can preserve someone's sort of like the last scan of their consciousness right as they die. And then they can access that and have conversations, and it's meant to be sort of a thing for closure. But he takes it, it's called the coda, and he decides like, hey, I could keep working on this hypothesis called the Perlman hypothesis that my dad was working on before he retired, and make my big breakthrough, get tenure, and that kind of thing. And he kind of uses this as a drive for why he keeps going back in his success. As you read the story, you realize like, I think there's something else going on here. He keeps visiting, and there's some of this emotional baggage that's happening that briefly gets touched on. Like he constantly is like, maybe he'll say something emotional this time, or he'll reference something about being excited. And his dad, who's not really his dad, it's a simulation of his dad, just can't do it. And whether that's because of who he was or is or whatever, they never get to that point. So eventually they do manage to develop I'm not big in mathematics, but some sort of resolution to this hypothesis. And Pauly becomes famous in the mathematics field, and he eventually has to make some decisions about his family, where they're going to live, or what they're going to do next. And at the end, he's just kind of like leaves the coda behind and drives away after sort of emotionally one last sort of void emotionally conversation with his dad. For me, this story is just extremely deep and moving. My dad died in 2020, and it wasn't that long. I don't remember exactly what month this story came out, but I read it, and I just remember basically I was reading on my Kindle because I have a subscription to Uncanny, and I sort of just let it drop to my chest, and it just was like, sorry, I'm also getting emotional right now, but it hurts to read. It really does. And that's not because my own dad was, totally emotional void or anything. It's just the idea of trying to explore those questions that you never got to explore in life and getting the chance to revisit it wasn't as valuable as he expected it to be.
Yeah.
And so in a way that was extremely healing to me. And I remember tweeting back and forth with Iriarte afterwards saying like, hey, this was really good for me. So for me, this story really spoke to me. So sorry, I'm getting worked up. So I'm just going to pause.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, my dad passed away back in 2014, and the tough part for me, now I had a great relationship with my dad, and so I don't really have anything to work out with him. And I feel like in this story it kind of says if you're going to work out something with someone, you got to do it while they're alive, and after they pass away, the work is all yours to figure that out. And so I'm grateful that I had a good relationship with my dad, but I miss him every time I read a new science fiction novel because I want to talk to him about it, and I can't do it. And if I had access to this Coda thing, I would totally go in there and say, hey, Dad, I just read this book. I want to talk to you about it. Even though, of course, he wouldn't have read it. And so it would hurt the conversation, but I would completely abuse the system and it would be bad. I think Juan put his hand up first, but we have a lot of people. So I'll type into the chat kind of the order we should go.
Yeah, so I can get a little personal into this for other reasons, because I've known Joe, as he calls, if you know him if you see him face to face, I've known him for a couple of years, and actually we have a similar background because we both grew up in Miami. We're about the same age, except I went to public school and he went to a fancy, one of the most famous private schools in Miami, which he found a little bit soul crushing. But so we have a lot in common. We talk about a lot in common. I usually see him at our local cons, and oh yeah, I saw that. I apologize. I know Joe, and I got to be careful of his pronouns. He doesn't care if you know him personally, but I do. He does use they and them. So the thing, and so I really did get into the story, like JW. My father passed away in 2019, and there was something. Except I felt that we said everything. We had a decent relationship, and we said everything that was said. But the idea of going back is obviously a classic one, and it really hit home. And also because I knew Joe, it really kind of also hit all the feels. This is the second big story that Joe's gotten some notice for, so hopefully he'll reap some benefits from it.
Yeah. Sarah, why don't you go next?
So this is this story is talking of uploading. It's a limited upload of a personality and memories as best they can, but the way it is in this story, there is no room for the uploaded persona to grow and evolve. If there were a way for it to grow and evolve, then it would be very creepy because of slavery implications. So I think it's interesting that this story stays just in that. And I agree that some people might abuse it to their own harm.
Yes.
It doesn't really harm the recording because it keeps forgetting over and over again. But so there are some interesting things in there about, effects on people. If we do get closer to this technology, I don't think we're that much closer than we were 20, 40 years ago to that kind, even the kind of level of persona uploading that is in this story, in this limited sense. But I also thought the comparison to almost an Alzheimer's experience of having to repeat from the beginning over and over again for someone who has forgotten, or it wasn't a direct comparison, but I thought it showed, that experience in a way that is maybe a little less hard for people to read than reading about dealing with a person with Alzheimer's, because it's just a persona. So anyway, there were definitely some interesting parts in this story.
Yeah. I feel like the Black Mirror version of this would be the personality in there can evolve and remember, and the slavery implication is definitely there. Cora, why don't you go ahead next?
Well, I also, I hadn't read this story before it was nominated, and initially I was a bit put off by the title because it was like, oh God, I remember that from math class. I was decent in math, and but it wasn't something I enjoyed. But when I read the story, I actually enjoyed it a lot. It's also one of the stories which hit you in the feels. And I think it particularly hits you in the feel if you have either, several of you have lost parents. My parents are both alive, but what hit me is the fact that Paulie can never really get his dad to tell him, "I'm proud of you, son," or something. Even though Paulie is actually in the same field as his father. He's in the same field. They're both mathematicians. Maybe Paulie even became a mathematician because his father was one, and they work on the same on this Perelman hypothesis. They work on this in the exact same field, but Paulie just never gets this, "Hey son, I'm proud of you." And I feel about this, for example, I'm a 3-time Hugo finalist, but my parents, they say like, "Oh, that's nice," but they don't particularly care. There's only two Hugo finalists in all of, there have only ever been 2 German Hugo finalists. The other one is Simone Heller, who was a novelette finalist in, I think, 2019, but it's like, oh yeah, that's not something they particularly care about. So yeah, I feel about this. And also what I liked is that actually the father in the end, because he is just dead and sort of simulation, doesn't even care that they solved this hypothesis, because the last time the son goes to see him, he says like, "Oh, we solved it and I got tenure and we published a paper and your name's on it and everything." And the father was like, "Oh yeah, that's nice, son." And he doesn't even care about this, which you think he would care about. And another thing I liked is because Paulie is a father himself. He has got a daughter called Maddie, I think, and she's good at mathematics. And like in so many cases, she had a better relationship with her grandfather than Paulie had with his father, because for some reason a lot of people are nicer or more caring towards their grandchildren. It's not the first time I've observed this in the family or families, that people who are absolutely terrible parents to their own children suddenly start being really caring about their grandchildren. And Paulie does try to do better, because he tries to show interest in his daughters. She has some kind of dance performance or something, and he tries to show interest and tries to tell her, "I'm proud of you." So he tries to, whether he will really do better, we don't know, but at least he tries. So yes, this is a story which makes you very emotional, I think, especially depending on what sort of parent and child relationships you have.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and go to Anne next, just because we haven't heard from you yet.
As we talked about this, I was struck by what a trap the coda was. You, as a personal experience, I've lost my mother, and I was thinking, it's been so long since I've actually heard her voice. I have no recordings of her. I don't have any video or anything of her. So it's been like years since I've actually heard her talk. And the coda would have allowed me to hear her talk. But in the coda, the son, who is obviously wanting to interact with his father desperately, cannot hear him say the things that he needs to hear. He can't hear him say, "Your child is wonderful. Your work is wonderful. You're wonderful." So the coda is a cruel trap. And I hope nobody ever develops it.
Yeah. Rob, why don't you go ahead and go next?
Okay, yeah. Excuse me one moment. There we go. Anyway, sorry, spam call there. Anyway, couple things about the story struck me. I like the implication that the main character, it was kind of on his way to being similarly distant parent to his daughter that his father was to him. And the implication, I think, is that he's learned a little something from his experience with the coda. And, you know, if he's going to be a more supportive parent to his daughter, he needs to start now, you know, that. But the other thing I thought, the idea of explaining everything over and over, you know, about the problem they're working on, you know, in every one of the meetings with the coda personality, it reminded me a little of, there's an early story by my hometown hero R.A. Lafferty called Rainbird. Anybody else familiar with it? It's kind of weird. Basically it deals with an inventor who does a lot of great stuff in like the late 18th and early 19th century. And then, you know, toward the end of his life, he's invented something like a time machine. But he's also kind of worried about having squandered so much of his time on blind alleys, scientifically, developmentally, and so on. So he decides to use his time machine to go back and explain to himself, his younger self, about all the stuff that he should avoid and, you know, focus on doing things on the right track. And suffice to say that when the younger self gets this info and does even greater technological stuff, he's still worried about all the blind alleys and stuff that he, you know, did. So he goes back and explains to his younger self, in turn, that self, and it repeats a couple times until finally it gets to a point where the younger self just cannot understand what the older self has been up to at all.
Right.
And so he never ends up becoming an inventor at all. And I thought it was interesting. The coda kind of has a similar cycle with proving this hypothesis, but it never quite gets to the point where the math is outside the comprehension of this simulated personality. And I thought that was kind of interesting, but, you know, rationalized well in the story. And, you know, it's too bad that you couldn't approach the emotional matters with his son in the same way.
Yeah.
So just wanted to mention.
Good stuff. Ivor, why don't you go ahead and go next?
Okay, so taking on board what people have said, I agree with a lot of it. One of the things that kind of got me through some of these stories, the majority of the stories, is something about the fact that there is death and connection and also potentially rebirth. But I did find this disturbing. I think the mathematics was a good kind of angle to have something cold to hang it off. There's no emotion in maths. I mean, I remember that from school. There is no emotion. And where is the emotion in death? Well, there's very little emotion in death because it's very final. The emotion hangs usually with those who are grieving. The dead probably maybe don't have. As somebody like everybody here, I lost a parent at 18. And if we had the coda, then I'm sure the question would be why, which never gets answered in life. So I think it's a really bad idea. But actually the answer is you have to get on with life. And I don't think the coda would ever actually help anybody in reality. It would end up just being a place for maybe people to self-therapy, but not actually in the right way.
Right.
But I found that there was a kind of an emancipation for the main character, and the fact that he actually became more of a human rather than a mathematician. And I've always thought the mathematicians were not quite human anyway. So
take that,
you know,
math. Yeah,
take that, math, Mr. Elf, my math teacher from being a kid. So yes, I found it. Yeah, there's something to say. So I've been in healthcare, so I've seen a lot of death. I wouldn't advise it because you wouldn't like the answers maybe if you had access to it.
Yeah. Amanda, why don't you go ahead and go next?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to thank Haley and Anne for chiming in the chat and earlier about the tech. I totally agree. And I'd like to just talk a little bit about the setting. First of all, it was impressive that so much about the setting, and I mean culture as well as physical, could be relayed in a story that was almost all in scene. Like it was dialogue, so much dialogue. Well done. And I'm bringing this up because I've worked in higher ed for 20 years. I went through a tenure process myself, and I've observed many of my friends who are professors go through a tenure process. And I think this is a very observant and accurate telling of the pressure of social capital for success to, facilitate success, and how that's happening in an environment where your own success as an individual is very isolating experience. There's not a lot of, kudos for group work in academia, and that creates an isolation that affects your personality and your sense of identity. And I think that this story did a great job of communicating that, especially the scene at the party where he breaks his wine glass and actually lacerates his hand. I was just like, yeah, that totally happens. And the career's gone because of one moment of weakness. So I thought that was good to see, because surprisingly, we don't see a lot of short stories, especially set in an academic setting. And that's surprising for science fiction more than fantasy, perhaps, because it's just, to me, the obvious place to look at the intersection of humans and science. So just a few comments on setting. Thanks.
Nice. Lisa, why don't you go ahead and go next?
Sure. I wanted to go back to something that Cora said about how the father didn't care about the son's achievements, because I actually read that a little bit differently. At the end, he actually is, I felt like I really liked how understated the emotional tension was all the way through. The conversations they had that touched on emotions weren't very dramatic, but it was clear that a lot was going on between the lines. And at the end, Polly says dad for the first time in many years. And I felt like that was kind of a big moment of some growth and feeling connection for him, but also the thank you for visiting that his dad always says at the end. It felt like as you wish to me. Like one of those phrases that meant something a whole lot bigger, and it's like he'd been saying it all along, but the son couldn't hear it. I don't know, maybe that's overly optimistic on my part, but that was kind of how that was my reading.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, also I wanted to mention the explaining things over and over also reminded me of Recursion by Blake Crouch.
Yeah, it reminded me actually a little bit of 11/22/63, the Stephen King book, where when he goes back in time and it's always to the same time, and he has to keep repeating the same actions every time he goes through. Lori, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this actually kind of builds off of what you were touching on, Lisa. There's a scene where that I think offers a lot of clarity about their relationship, where the dad says at one point, I thought you wanted me to be your colleague. I thought that was the relationship that we could have. And I thought that was a really accurate illustration of how so many times in life, especially with people we love but have a fraught relationship with, we kind of talk around each other. And it sounds like they had this period of estrangement after his parents were divorced. And then the way dad was able to re-enter Polly's life was through academia, through having the same profession, the same professional interests. So I think, of course, we don't know a whole lot about dad. We just have this snapshot of him, but giving him the best possible interpretation, he thought, maybe this is my son's boundary. This is how I'm allowed to participate in his life. And so that's what he did. And he acted like a colleague. And the whole time, Polly really wants him to be a father. And they just can't get to a place where they can both say what it is that they need, what they can offer, and what they're willing to accept. And I think that that's really common. And I think that it was done so well and felt very authentic to me. So I think that this story really packs a lot of relationship issues into just a few words. And I think it was very well executed.
Yeah. Cora, did you have something you wanted to respond
to? Yes, one thing that also struck me is that almost every time Paulie goes into the coda, the father immediately starts off with with, oh yes, there's a what's life insurance policy or something in some desk or something or something. And Paulie obviously this is apparently something that's very important to the father, and he's always starting off with his life insurance policy because of course he can't remember any of the other things. And the son says, yeah, we found it. And at some point he even says, thank you for doing this, because at this point Paulie realizes this was apparently his father's attempt to take care of his funeral costs and his loved ones. And yeah, this is also a thing, and sometimes I have with my parents that really go on about something which is like, oh, you must remember that these and these documents are there and there. And I'm like, okay, yeah, okay, fine. I know they don't really care. But yes, they keep talking past each other. And also, who was it said this thank you for visiting. This may really have been the father's attempt to do something, to say something nice. It's like, oh, because he didn't expect his son to visit him. Also, I think the father, at one point he actually says like, yeah, why are you here? Do you want to tell me I'm a shit father? I was a shit father. Yeah, I know this. So yeah, the father does actually know, but they're both not really great at connecting emotionally. And of course, Paulie could use one of his visits to just tell father, okay, tell me how you feel about me, but instead he'll go on the Perlman hypothesis. So yeah, they're both not really great at connecting emotionally, probably also because they have this very unemotional profession of mathematician. And yes, it's a really well done story.
Yeah. And you have your hand up. Did you have something else to say, or just forget to put it down? There we go. Okay. All right. Anything else we want to talk about this story? Proof by
If I
induction?
may just circle back now that I'm back under control here. I think for me, one of the most powerful things about this story is that the colleague and father sort of connection, because of how easy it is as a child to sort of like try to figure out that relationship with your parent through whatever means you can find. And for him, it was, hey, I'm not getting that emotional thing that I need. So maybe I can find that through chasing mathematics and solving this hypothesis. And it doesn't work. And I think that's what makes this whole story work for me, is that there's this realization, Paulie has to come to this realization that this isn't going to work. And he realizes in a way that the coda is maybe not monstrous, but isn't what he needs it to be. And he's in denial most of the story. Like he's like, nope, I'm just using it for math. That's all it's there for. And it's clearly not. Like anyone who reads the story is like, well, obviously there's more going on here. But that sort of at the end when he drives away and he's just like done with it, it's not like necessarily that he's healed fully, but that he's realized that he needs to heal, and sort of pursuing this sort of like mold that he was trying to make himself into isn't working. So I just wanted to add that on.
Yeah. Well, and Haley made a good point in the comments too. And I'm trying to figure out if I can publish the chat. I'll get everybody's permission first. But Haley's point was that, maybe you have to work on healing yourself, which is a great point.
Yeah, when I was reading it, I was just like, he's just banging his head against the wall. He's never going to get what he needs or what he wants. Yeah. And that was frustrating for me to read.
Yeah. All right. Anything else from anybody on this one? Otherwise, Haley, I have you up next to talk about The Sin of America.
Alrighty, let's hop in there. Okay. The Sin of America by Catherynne and Valente, published in Uncanny Magazine, issue 39. I'm going to do like a rough overview of the plot.
Okay.
A woman called Ruby Rose Martineau, an ordinary American living in a ho-hum town called Sheridan, has been chosen to eat the sin of America. A little bit about her backstory is that her family owned a butterfly farm. She was a dancer. She tried to leave. She ends up, back home. She has a child. She's just trying to survive. Like all of us, she is utterly unique and also utterly run-of-the-mill. She is an every woman. She has been chosen to eat the sin of America and to complete her horrifying task, which we don't really understand what it is until the end, really. She shows up at the Blue Bison Diner and Souvenir Shop. The story spends a lot of time and energy creating a snapshot of the physical space and its customers and its employees and the things that are happening, what people are thinking. We observe the minutiae of everyday small town USA as she dives into her horrible task, served truly American style, gorging on chicken tenders, patty melts, milkshakes, that kind of thing. She eats and eats. It is delicious and horrible. She's not sure why she's been chosen to do this horrible task, but everyone believes it must be done and that things will be better after. When she's done, she gets up and walks out. Shortly thereafter, she is beaten to death on the side of the road. Her transfiguration into a complete scapegoat has been complete. And the implication is that this will keep happening. So that is high level overview. This story is a lot, especially when you start a story that has a content warning about both violence against women and child death. It's going to be intense. I had to research the concept of sin eating. I wasn't raised Christian, so a lot of this type of symbolism and mythology can really kind of go over my head. So I Googled, and it turns out that there's a history of sin eating. It's a person who eats a ritual meal in order to spiritually take on the sins of a dead person. This food absorbs the sins of the deceased, thus absolving the soul of the person. Yeah, so that was interesting. Sin eating in the modern sense is traditionally Welsh, apparently. By consuming bread and drink, usually wine or beer, placed on or ritually waved over the dead body, onlookers believe the dead person's sins were digested by the eater after he or she consumed this beggar's feast. I also didn't realize how much sin eating is in popular culture. The name of a Marvel Comics villain, Margaret Atwood, wrote a short story called it. There's so much to it, and I had no idea. And so I read the story 3 times. The first time it was all lost on me, and then I took a deep dive, and then it started to make more and more sense. And it's a lot.
It is, yeah. Sarah, go ahead.
So in other stories, Catherynne Valente has a lot to say about America and consumerism. And, so this is more continuation of that. Some of her work, I mean, it's not all that, but certainly it's a major strand, and especially lately, looking at her other finalists this year. But some of her stories I really love reading. This one was hard for me to read. I mean, literally my eyes kept skittering down because I didn't want to fully engage with what was happening in the story. So I am sure Valente wrote it well and with, in her intention, but boy, this one, rereading it again before our discussion, again, really hard. I think there is value in the story. She's got such a range of style and tone in her writing. I think she's a great writer. I had difficulty with this one. I think, the points about what went into this, all the analogies and everything, right? Great writer, difficult read.
Yeah, very much so. Rob, go ahead. Rob, you're still on mute.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, this is amazing. There's a lot in this story, and I had a hard time with it too, but it's like, I mean, the fact that, it's not just the sin of one person or the sin of a community, but the sin of an entire country. It's almost too big to contemplate, but at the same time, in some ways it does seem, very timely and, some emotionally fraught moment in history. And I had a hard time connecting with it again because it is almost too big to comprehend, but formally it reminded me, and thematically it reminds me a little of Shirley Jackson, The Lottery. It has a similar kind of dynamic going on with someone picked as a scapegoat and killed at the end. Sorry to spoil The Lottery for anybody. I will have to read it again at least once before voting, just to see, to evaluate it for sure. But as noted, there's a lot in this story, both in terms of description and thematically, and the way it goes from, and the thing I found the most chilling was, we have the news headlines about the one guy who seems to have done all this absolutely terrible stuff, and then the news switches to all the bad stuff attributed to the woman who's just been killed. And I thought, oh no, oh boy, woo. So I really admire Valente for swinging for the fences with this one. So, but yeah, I've got to read it again for sure.
Yeah, Haley in the chat had mentioned The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, and that's the one that was on my mind as well. Lisa, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. I also had Omelas in my notes to talk about for this one. Yeah, I mean, the idea of one person suffering to sort of preserve the status quo and the peace and equilibrium for an entire society. Also, for anyone who listens to my podcast or follows me on Twitter, I'm possibly a bit of a broken record on the subject of how much I love Catherynne Valente's prose. And this is another gorgeous example. Just every sentence this woman writes is like beautifully constructed, in my opinion.
Sorry, I had myself muted. I didn't see who was next. Cora, why don't you go ahead?
Well, this is an extremely well written and deeply, deeply unpleasant story, and it's a more horrible story actually than the actual horror story, because we have an actual horror story among the finalists, and this is the more horrible of the two stories. However, probably because I'm not American, one thing I really, really loved about this is this whole small town America setting with this tacky diner and the tacky souvenir shop and the people in the diner, the pregnant waitress and everything. This is really, it's like, okay, it feels, this is like, okay, this is sort of, it's cliche America, but it's also very, 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 also, it's not just a cliche, it's the people have embraced the cliche, because we get a lot of backstory about this diner and the woman who created it and who picked out all of these really tacky decor options, and then was run over by the biggest horse trailer anybody has ever seen, and also the diner food. So yes, it was okay. If I was driving along a road somewhere in Wyoming or Montana or wherever this is set, which is a part of the US I've actually never visited, but I think, okay, I can really imagine stopping there, going into this diner and saying, oh, wow, this is so wonderfully American. American. So yeah, this is something which really worked. Another thing I really loved is the thing about the butterfly farm, because Ruby Rose, the poor woman who's been picked to eat the sins of America, America hates butterflies and she's terrified of them. And her parents have a butterfly farm, which is another of these very American things, these very, very weird roadside attractions, which were advertised along highways and basically say like, oh, let's go there. And when I was 5, my dad, we lived in the US in Mississippi for almost a year, and we drove my dad worked there, and when there was a holiday weekend or something, we drove all around from literally Miami to San Antonio and all the way up to Chattanooga. So saw a lot, and there are a lot of weird roadside attractions, and we pretty much visited them all because my parents were like, we want to see everything. And also, I think I was not yet in school, but old enough to decipher signs and go like, oh, look, they say we must go to Rock City. Rock City is wonderful, which I still actually remember, Rock City. And there were a lot of similar weird things. We didn't visit the butterfly farms, thankfully, which is another thing, because mostly butterflies are considered, oh, they're so beautiful and wonderful. And I hate butterflies. I'm terrified of them. Oh. And actually, my horror of butterflies also stems from this time in Mississippi, because my mother couldn't drive at the time. And when we went to the mall, it was in walking distance, and we had to go through some kind of patch of wilderness, which was full of huge, I'm from North Germany, so we don't get very big butterflies. They were huge and they were fluttering all around, and I was absolutely terrified of them. So yeah, I totally sympathize with this. And also about this other guy, and the Christopher Salazar is his name, who's on the news like, oh, he's the worst person ever. And for a while, I was like, am I supposed to know who Christopher Salazar is? Is this some kind of infamous serial killer or politician everybody hates? And then, in the end, when someone says Ruby Rose Martineau did all the horrible things, then I realized like, oh yeah, Christopher Salazar was just a poor guy who was the last sin eater and who was beaten to death, which also tells you, yeah, it's not going to end. It's not going to end with Ruby Rose. They're never going to feel better. The next sin eater is probably already chosen and sitting in a roadside diner somewhere, eating a whole lot of food and waiting to be beaten to death.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's an extremely well written and very atmospheric story, which is also extremely unpleasant to read.
So I have to say that reading the story, I had never heard of anyone not liking butterflies, and so now I found out that in fact in the real world, people don't like butterflies. So that I learned something new today. I actually kind of like bugs, just not spiders. Anne, why don't you go ahead and go next?
I think I got it all in the right
you
order
got it.
now. Okay. I was just going to comment that the skill of the writer is amazing, and I'm familiar with her from her children's book, The Girl, the title of which is amazing. The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making, which is a fabulous book. But for this particular short story, what amazed me was, if you think about it, or what I thought was that every aspect that she brings up has a horror element to it. I mean, everything that she talks about is in turn made horrible, like eating delicious food is made horrible. Butterflies made horrible. All of the aspect, the diner, which could have been charming, is made horrible. Traveling on a on a road, splat, run over by another truck and dragged for miles, a big splat of blood. I mean, every aspect that you think of in the book, it's horrible. And the skill of that is amazing. And you don't really realize that everything is horrible until you've sort of digested the book a little bit, because you're just going, I can't read this anymore. I can't read this anymore. It's just an amazing, horrible story. And it's really great.
Juan, you had something to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to initially follow up on what Lisa said, that I'm also a fan of Catherynne Valente, and this shows her range. I mean, she's also got a novella up, which is kind of in the middle of, because I think at one extreme you've got space opera, which is a complete laugh out loud Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy like comedy, and then you've got The Past is Red, which is kind of in the middle, and then you've got The Sin of America, and it's just incredible range, and it's just amazing that you can do, she can go all through the emotional spectrum that well. I also want to mention to people, just to I think this is also an audio story, because again, I think I remember listening to it while I was on my bicycle, which is kind of interesting, experience as it was. I'm also surprised at the terrorization that people are terrorized of butterflies, particularly since a friend of mine, when they got married, instead of throwing rice, and I don't think this caught on, they would have these packets and they would release butterflies, and because I guess they thought it was better than killing birds with rice. So, and I think it had mixed results at that wedding, and I guess it hasn't caught on in other weddings.
Your mileage may vary with butterflies, I'm finding. JW, go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree with all of the things said about the prose here. I think this is probably the strongest prose of any of the short stories. However, on my end, at least, I found it to be a bit of a idea for a story in search of a plot. There wasn't really that much that happened. I was all in at the beginning because I loved the little vignette of her life summary. I was like, I'm I'm on board with Ruby here. Like, let's go. And then I guess it was sort of a shocking end for me because I definitely didn't expect it to end how it did. It kind of felt to me like there wasn't enough meat on the bones of the plot for my own taste. But I love the prose, so I could read her all day. I just wanted to go somewhere.
Sure. Ivor, go ahead.
Haley touched on this earlier, but I think the main symbolism for me was about how somebody who was probably poor and a non-entity takes on the sin and suffers for it for the rich and the famous. And I know going back into our medieval history over here, it's always like the royals would have a sin eater who would take away all people, local dignitaries, etc., because it is the poor who are just basically invisible, faceless. They can disappear, but their reputations as rich and famous and powerful has to pervade. So I like that bit.
Yeah. Any final comments on this one from anybody? Anybody we missed? All right. Let's go ahead and move on to Tangles by Seanan McGuire. And Cora, you have the recap for that one.
Okay, so Tangles is a story by Seanan McGuire, which was published on the Magic the Gathering website. They apparently publish a monthly short story, and Seanan is a great Magic the Gathering fan. And this is also a story I had not read before it was nominated for Hugo. And also I have never played Magic the Gathering, so I was a bit worried whether I would understand it, but I did. So let's have a recap. Okay, so the story is about Ren, who's a dryad. And Ren has lost her original tree. So a dryad is a tree nymph who lives in the tree. And Ren lost her original tree to a forest fire, but she took the fire into herself, and now she can walk the plains. So she can, which I think are probably different layers of reality or parallel universes. She can walk the plains with her tree. Other dryads are rooted in place. But Ren can also move from tree to tree, but it needs to be a special tree which sings in the same harmony. And Ren has just lost her last tree, 6, who has grown tired of walking the plains and just wants to go back to his forest, and she's looking for a new one. But the only tree she hears is still a sapling and way too small to carry Ren and the fire she has inside her. And the other protagonist is Teferi, a mage, who is in a place called Innistrad, and working and helping the people there. And the people of Innistrad say they've seen a white witch in the woods and ask Teferi to take care of the problem. This white witch is Ren, who's looking for her new tree. So they track the witch, and Teferi notices what she is that she's a dryad and no risk, and takes the soldiers away. But some kind of unseen monster tracks them, and Teferi uses his magic to send the monster away, and his magic twists up time, and now suddenly Ren can't hear her tree anymore because the paths in the wood have grown all tangled, and she's of course angry at Teferi, wants to help but can't untangle his magic, but Ren can with her skills. So it's described really well as they describe that the magic is untangled like you untangle some messed up hair, or wool, and yes, they untangle the magic, and because they fix time, but some change has happened. So now the new tree, the sapling, is now a big tree and also adventurous. So Ren has a new tree, which will be her 7th tree. And the thing is, it's a very nice story about 2 or rather 3, because we also have the tree in here. Very different beings cooperating and working together. And the descriptions of how Ren perceives the tree and her tree perceives the magic are very well done. The thing which doesn't quite work is a monster, because maybe if I knew more about Magic the Gathering, I would know what sort of, but it was just like, oh, there's an unseen monster. Okay, wave my hand, it's gone. So, but really, you don't need to play Magic the Gathering to understand the story. It's it's quite nice. It's a nice story, and yes, I think some people were a bit surprised that this one was nominated. Also, some people apparently had some issues with it. But then Shauna McGuire, she's a very good writer, and she's also a very popular writer. Mm-hmm. And yes, she gets a lot of shit for, she's got all those Hugo nominations. However, there have been other cases where a story was nominated more on the strengths of the author. I mean, the best case is this John Scalzi story from, I think, 10 years ago, Shadow of the Night Dragon or whatever, which was a joke. It was literally an April's Fool joke, and it got a Hugo nomination. And for some reason, hardly anybody complained about that one. I wonder why it is. Maybe because John Scalzi is a white guy. And there have also been other cases where I've thought, like, okay, this and this story is probably wouldn't have nominated, but it's an interesting fantasy story.
Yeah, like you, I don't have any experience with Magic the Gathering. The only gathering I recognize is from Highlander up there. So I was worried as well that I wouldn't be able to get into the story, but I do like Shauna McGuire's writing, and so I found it kind of a fun little vignette. Juan, you had your hand up.
Well, I read this because Shannon's on my Twitter feed, and she did point, hey, everybody read this story, and I did, and I was kind of surprised. I was surprised because I didn't know anything about Magic the Gathering, and to me, it was a great story about cooperation. I felt it to be a very positive story. I mean, I was all for it. I was really into it. I mean, so it was kind of a pleasant surprise that it showed up. As I said, it was a pleasant. I don't know what to expect because it was a related related to an IP I'm not familiar with, but I was able to get into it. It was basic, fantasy tropes, and get into it. And two people have a problem and they figure out how to solve it by working together.
Yeah, I was curious and maybe Sarah, you mentioned in the chat that you know something about Magic the Gathering. Is this using existing characters, or is it fan fiction? Or, I mean, that's kind of, it reads like fan fiction to me, other than the fact that the quality of the writing is better than fan fiction.
I don't recognize the monsters that were used. It has been a few years since I played. I had hundreds of cards. I've certainly played a lot. I enjoyed designing decks and putting things together, because there are things in Magic where different types of mana you can tap for different types of magic. And so I enjoyed when the characters were discussing how their different magics work different from each other. That's definitely part of the Magic the Gathering. The specific creatures and characters I don't recognize. In Magic play, I suppose someone could pile on a lot of character interpretation to it, but really it's types. You've got archetypes of, you've got a dryad, and you might have in Magic the Gathering 20 different types or 50 different types of dryads. I don't know how far they've gone, but most of the time they are not named. Most of the gameplay doesn't have anything to do with personalities interacting other than whatever the players bring to the game. Some people like to just design pretty decks, and some people are in it for the kill. So, I wasn't really thinking about Magic the Gathering when I read it. I guess for me, I followed the link to the next Hugo short story nomination, and there it was, and I read it. So I wasn't really even thinking about that context so much, but I guess it did make a lot of sense to me just because I already had some familiarity with it. Okay, that's for now.
Okay, Amanda, go ahead.
Yeah, this is also coming from a place of not like, unlike Sarah, I have never played in Magic the Gathering. Well, I actually tried to learn once, and it seems like a solid game, but I'm not a player. And I just wanted to say that my partner Olav is, and very knowledgeable. And I'm trying to remember, we had a conversation about this story. It was brief, but my understanding is that this piece was commissioned specifically to create a narrative connection between the characters, and at least one of them is an iconic Magic character. So it's from his perspective, this was an important work that was functional in a way that puts the narrative, pushes it along, I guess, in that world, but for what it's worth.
Okay. Sarah, go ahead.
So yes, when Magic the Gathering first started, it was just cards. Then they started putting more of their cards on websites. They have lately been getting more into trying to make it just a whole world you can live in all the time. So they've done more of that in the last 5 or 10 years than they did when it had come out originally. So I think the point about commissioning, tell more stories about these characters, I'm not sure if they're going to be taking it in what more they're going to be doing with it. They may be looking to start putting on an MMORPG. I'm not sure. It'll be interesting to see what all they do with it. I haven't kept up I'm not up to speed on its current, but I have noticed they've been doing a lot of trying to showcase the artists and ideas in it. Then of course there's things we could get into about labor issues with the creators for MTG and all of that. But I'm sure this is part, they're not just throwing money at artists for fun. I'm sure they're, trying to keep the game relevant and interesting to people.
Nice. JW, go ahead.
I was just going to comment that I would love to see the Hugos add a category for IP tie-in fiction. I think that would be a phenomenal and super fun category, and this would be a great story to have in there. I haven't played Magic the Gathering in probably 20 years. I was so into it that I made my own decks, but I also invented my own game with like cardstock cards and tried to imitate it. But I found this particular story to be sort of tropey was like a word that was used, I think, by Juan, and that's how it felt to me. It was just, I could see it as like a tie-in story. I didn't really resonate with the characters or the ideas, but or the storytelling. But I did like the cooperation angle of it, which frankly we don't get a lot of that in a lot of speculative fiction. A lot of it is centered around conflict, and I enjoyed seeing them come together in a way that was solving a problem together instead of immediately like, we're enemies, let's fight.
Right. Yeah. Cora, why don't you go ahead?
Yes, well, about the cooperation, what JW just said, yeah, that's a nice aspect. Of course, we do have, it feels almost Star Trek-y, because Star Trek is a lot of like, oh, here's a problem, let's work together and, well, to quote Andy Weir's, science the shit out of it. Of course, they're not sciencing the shit out of it, they're magicking the shit out of it. It's to solve the problem, and they'll solve Ren's problem in the bargain. So yeah, this is an aspect I like. It's a common, this cooperation aspect is more common in science fiction, where we often have, here's a problem, let's work together to solve it. I mean, Proof by Induction is sort of that sort of story, except that it's not really about the Perlman hypothesis. So here we have the fantasy version. And about this being a tie-in, this is not actually the first tie-in, which I think some people also had issues with. But yes, it's a media tie-in, but the Hugos have never said that a media tie-in cannot be nominated. And this isn't even the first media tie-in to be nominated. The first was a story called The Butcher of Kharkov, I forgot the name. It was some kind of Ethiopian sounding name by Dan Wells was his name. I've forgotten what it was a tie-in to, some kind of video game or RPG, I don't know. No, and a lot of people have forgotten that one is A, it was not very good, and B, it was a puppy finalist in 2014. It was one of the first sad puppy finalists, and so yeah, it had a lot of stacked against it, and also the problem was it wasn't a good story. That one was just I've forgotten also about it, except that it was a really bad story or not a good story, let's say, or maybe it would have been better if I knew the source material. This is a good story, and yes, it's a media tie-in, but it might actually, I mean, the Dragon Awards have a media tie-in category, and there is a specific media tie-in award, the Scribe Awards. What I'm not sure if it would work for the Hugos. It would probably have to be not a Hugo, like the Lodestar, because there's nothing to stop a media tie-in story from being nominated for a Hugo. And since the same work can't be nominated in more than one category, we would need not a Hugo Award for media talent, which I would actually not be against. But yeah, getting new Hugo categories added is a chore and really difficult. And I think the next new one will be best game, which I'm also, even though I'm not at all a gamer, all in favor for. Also, yes, that's more or less what I wanted to say.
Nice. Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, so with last year being the first video game category for the Hugos, I think, and also this year, one of the best novel finalists has a lot to do with video game music. I having sung in a video game music orchestra, I'm excited to see all of this. And I do think it's a recognition that a lot of things are tied together more and more. And there are some people who don't get your chocolate in my peanut butter or whatever, but I think for a lot of people, it's exciting to see them mixed together. And I guess some people might be worried that big game vendors or big IP vendors might be pushing their stuff for category wins. How is that different from best dramatic presentation, long form, etc.? It's not, there's always a chance that money's going to come in, but really, how much of a risk is it for novel and short story, et cetera, et cetera? We'll see.
Anything else to say on this story from anybody? Final thoughts? Otherwise, we can move on to Unknown Number. And I have Lisa for the recap on that one.
Yes. So the next one up is Unknown Number by Blue Neustifter. And I wanted to introduce this one because it's one I nominated and I really enjoyed it. It also had similar to Tangled, it also had an unusual route to this list of nominees because it was first published as a Twitter thread of screenshots that looked like a phone screen showing text messages. And the entire story takes place as a text conversation. It's written in the grammar of text message, which makes it deceptively simple. It's a very quick read. It's probably the least, not that I counted, but it's probably the least words in any of the nominees based on how quick a read it was. And it does so much in those few words. So a quick plot summary, a middle-aged trans woman named Gabby received a text message by someone introducing themselves as her dead name. And the other person is living in another timeline and has spent an entire career developing technology to communicate across the multiverse with the end goal of finding a timeline where she transitioned. And the time span, the total time span covered in the story is maybe an hour. Because Gabby goes for a walk at one point because she needs to get some space. There is, in that hour, there's so much personal growth and character development. And it's clear that life is going to be different for at least one of the characters after this conversation. And so this is one that really worked for me on an emotional level. I appreciated the unique format. And I think the fact that it had an unusual publication path and made enough of an impression to be nominated says that it really struck a chord with a lot of people.
Yeah. Amanda, I think you had said you had some things you wanted to say on this one.
Oh, sure, I'll start. Well, it was just, I'm just like, Lisa did such a great job of recapping. I was like, yes. This is such a wonderful, gentle introduction to the issues related to gender dysphoria and the pain they cause, and so you could just talk about that forever. But Lisa did such a good job of introducing that. As a librarian, as a librarian who was working before the internet was a thing, these kinds of stories still really excite me when you have an author that is empowered from a publishing sense to connect with their readers, find an audience in such an accessible, democratic way. And I mean that in the context of publishing. There's no intermediation here. There's no gatekeeping. There's nothing between the author and the reader except Twitter. And that was the author's voice. So a lot of my work is about empowering authors, and it just makes me so happy to see this path to celebrating a very worthy creative work. So I hope that doesn't like reveal too much that I'm super rooting for this one, but it was a fabulous read, and I'm glad it's on the ballot.
Nice. Rob, why don't you go ahead and go?
Yeah, as I said, this was the only one of the nominees that I had read before the nominations, and I just encountered it on Twitter like most everybody else, and I liked it just as much when I reread it, and again, I found myself grouping it with both the Harrow and the Iriarte stories, but it's like one deals about the relationship with one's children, another or whoever or whatever children you might be in charge of. Another deals with relationship with one's parents, but this one, in a way, even though it's the simplest in a way, it hits deeply because it's about the relationship with oneself.
Yeah.
And I think even people who don't, identify with the specific dilemma, faced by the person who's making contact through the unknown number, still, that we all have things we wonder about, roads not taken in our lives, things like that. And so it's, even if you don't have much personally in common with the character, it's still easy to identify with that dilemma. So yeah.
JW, go ahead.
I know that I've appeared on the podcast for sharing some of my background before, but I grew up in a very conservative background, and coming out of that and being affirming, and this story for me, it taught me things, and I think that's what good science fiction does, is it explores the human condition, and it teaches you. And it made me laugh out loud, it made me tear up, it made me empathize, and I think I don't remember exactly where the line was, but something about like, hey, trans people are often sort of put in like this like fishbowl and like looked at from the outside, and like how often I've probably done that unintentionally, and I just truly appreciated the author's willingness to share some of that and teach in a way that I hadn't encountered before. So I'm all on board for this story too. I loved it, and again, I learned from it.
Yeah. JW and I have talked about, and we come from similar backgrounds, and it's the same kind of appreciation for this one from me, just because I don't have a lot of insight in this way, and so this story was really, really eye-opening to me. Cora, why don't you go ahead and go next?
Well, yes, I read the story when it on Twitter. I wasn't following Blue at the time, but it was just someone retweeted it into my timeline and was very impressed by it. And again, there's been some complaints about, it's a Twitter thread nominated for Hugo, but it's a short story. It just happens to be published on the medium of Twitter. Also, Jennifer Egan published her Twitter story Black Box back in 2012. So honestly, that's 10 years ago. We've had 10 years of Twitter fiction. This isn't even the only Twitter fiction on the ballot this year. We have in Best Fan Writer, we have Bitter Carella, who does those Midnight Society tweets. So Twitter, and we've had O. Weston, who does a micro science fiction account, hit the long list for fan writers. So yes, Twitter fiction is a thing now, and it's absolutely appropriate for the Hugo. And of course, Twitter is also the perfect medium for what is essentially a story in text messages. And I'm not from a conservative background, but let's say in real life, I did not have a lot of contact with trans people. I, of course, knew trans people exist. I don't have a problem with it, but I didn't really have a lot of insights. And we've seen quite a few stories about the trans experience in recent years on the Hugo ballot. Some people complain like, oh, it's too much, or it's a trend, but it's not a trend. It's simply that now we're at a point where trans writers can talk about and write about these issues, and people, and also they get published. I mean, we've had stories about the trans experience going back almost 100 years, except that they were often very coded about magical sex changes and that sort of thing. I've read a story about an actual trans woman with it was not the way we would describe this today, but I've read a story about a trans woman and her experiences, Roberta by Margaret St. Clair, which was published in 1962. That's 60 years ago. So none of this is new. It just had problems getting published. And now we're finally seeing more trans stories being published. And of course, we see more of them on the Hugo ballot. And a lot of them are good stories. This is actually, I think, one of those which really, because it contrasts Gabby with her unhappy dad name self, and also we never get the dad name. It's literally blanked
Redacted,
out. So which also tells how painful this dad name is to Gabby, and this is probably, if you want an introduction to the trans experience and the dysphoria, this is probably one of the best stories to give someone. And yeah, it's a great story, and also I'm glad it made the ballot. And what Amanda says about the empowering publishing, of course, self-publishing has also been available for a while now, and there have been some complaints by self-published authors that, oh, no indie author ever makes the Hugo ballot, and so this is actually wrong, because we've had the first self-published story we had on the Hugo ballot was again by Seanan McGuire. I forgot the name, but it was a story she published on her website, and I think it was in 2012 or something like that. So also 10 years ago, and yeah, I'm really happy for the story, and story that it made the ballot, and it's a great story. And also Blue Neustifter, I think, is an author to watch.
Nice. Haley, go ahead.
Yeah, the theme of the story is like utterly fantastic, and I think it really humanizes the issue of being trans for a lot of people that may not have familiarity with it. But I think it's the structure to me that really is just blows my mind. And I haven't read a ton of stories in this format before, but it's so intimate. I mean, all of us text usually for a big chunk of the day, and so I think to be able to see this exchange is very special in a way, because like it's not a play, like I can't imagine reading this like on a printed piece of paper with like colons and then stage direction. It's like you're reading over somebody's shoulder, which makes me like super interested in it too, because like you're invited into this very private space. And I don't know, I was blown away by how effective that was for me.
I have to call out one of the sidebar comments here from Lori. Do you want to just fess up to it?
Yeah, Haley, I called us both out in the chat. I said while you were talking, that we both freely admit to reading other people's texts on Marta. I mean, what else do you have to do while you're sitting there?
I mean, if you're doing it on a train, and also I love it when someone's obviously typing out like a huge paragraph, because I'm like, ooh, someone's in trouble.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said about the format, Haley, being really interesting to read. And it's funny to me that, well, I guess it's not funny to me, people will complain about anything, but the fact that it was posted on Twitter just makes sense for that format. I mean, it would feel sort of weird, not that it couldn't be in a print magazine or something, but it makes more sense that you're looking at your phone and seeing screenshots of a text exchange. So to me, that seems like a natural way to present that story.
And it's super authentic, because it's not just like big bubbles, it's like lots of small messages, like, no, okay, shit, blah, blah, blah. So like, it just really captures the cadence of messaging in real life.
Yeah. I really like that kind of playing with the format and using a different medium for doing it. It's really cool. Go ahead, Anne.
Got it.
There we go, getting faster.
No, that totally is what made that story so alive, was the format. That's that was an eye-opener. The format was like such a surprise, and you're totally right. The format was what brought it to life. It would not have worked as a sheet of paper. in a magazine or anywhere else. That's what made the story.
Yeah, very cool. Juan, go ahead.
I actually have to disagree, but I think it could work in a story because there've been a lot of stories that are essentially a chats. In fact, a lot of them have been. I mean, I think Cora's touched upon it. I think if I recall, last year there was a story where two robots are on a chat group and discussing their problems, and you're working the problem through the chat. So it's not uncommon, and I've got no problem if it was published on Twitter. Just like it wouldn't have shown up on any of. I don't know if I don't think it showed up at least on any of my recommended reading lists because I usually do a big cram of short stories from around the end of Thanksgiving up until nominating closes. So, and I try to read as much as I can and where I can. And there's two main lists I usually go to it. So I didn't see that. So that's the only negative I could see about being on Twitter. Would have been harder to find, at least for some people. But
yeah, but
chat stories are very common.
Yeah. On the other hand, I feel like the format for it with the screenshots of text make it very accessible, right? You don't have to fight through any exposition or description of things. It's just focusing on that chat. So I really like the way it just kind of sheds all the rest of the trappings of the short story and just boils it down to this conversation between these two people. There's one person, two aspects of the one person. I guess it is two people, different universes. Amanda, go ahead.
Yeah, just listening and reading in the chat about how this could have worked in print. And yeah, it probably could have. But for me anyway, and the reading experience when you're using the medium of Twitter, your brain's in a different place. Like there's something more, the visceral act is different. You're interpreting it in a different way. And I think Haley and Lisa might have both said this, that you, and just to repeat to bolster, it's just more emotional. You're more engaged. You're more there, and that kind of immersion is more intense when you're using a medium you wouldn't normally use to read prose. So it's sort of a slippery sideways way of engaging the author. So
yeah,
kind of.
Yeah, very cool. Any other thoughts on this one? We can move on. We're on to the final story. Okay, talking about playing with kind of the medium here. Sarah, you're going to give us a recap for Where Oaken Hearts Do Gather.
Okay, so a very quick recap, and then I want to talk about the structure a little bit, is an academic gets in over their head, knows something bad happened to the last researcher, and yet goes ahead anyway and exits stage right in their speculation about what happened. Yes. Cora mentioned earlier two horror stories among the finalists, and I'm guessing this is the other one that you meant. So this is an exploration of how memory, tradition, oral and written history collide with horror. So structurally, the story is a series of threaded comments by different people collaborating and arguing about the meaning and history of a folk song, Where Oaken Hearts Do Gather, with a possibly supernatural interpretation. And for the people, most of the people in the comments, this is all some kind of quaint old song. And the comments in the story are like what you'll find on the Wikipedia talk page for the old ballad Barbara Allen, or on genius.com if you go and look at annotations about different songs where there are highlight sections, and if you click on the highlights you'll see what other people had to say, what they think about the lyrics or the history and so on. So Sarah Pinsker wrote the lyrics for the song in this story, so there's bits of the song that are quoted, and then there are footnotes and comments and so on in the story itself. And she draws on her knowledge of traditional murder ballads. That is a thing for those who don't know, and their variations, and her knowledge of folklorists, as in one character's reference to real life researcher Alan Lomax, who I've heard referred to on the Library of Congress's Folk Life Today podcast, which is all about folk songs. And so, real people, Pinsker has a great deep knowledge of this. So that's kind of on the surface, but as you're actually reading the story, the more you look at it, the more you see that not only was there something spooky going on in the song, it's a living song with a living tradition, which is not safe to explore. It's dangerous and disturbing, not dusty old history. So if some people will look at this and bounce right off it, I get that. For me, it was my jam. If this is at all the same sort of thing you're interested in, Pinsker does a really good job weaving together characters' comments together for subtle shivers as it starts to dawn on you what happened to this, poor guy, Henry Martin, who got in over his head.
Barrow Boy marked that as a bit of a stretch. I have to say that I have very little room in my heart for poems or songs in my prose fiction, and I thought this was spectacular. I right at the beginning I started to bounce off of it because I thought, no, this is not my thing. And then once I got the kind of first little clue that there was something going on here, I thought, okay, 100% in. I love the playing with the genre, and delivering this story through comments on lyric genius. It's fantastic. Go ahead, Lisa.
Sure. I love how Sarah Pinsker uses her music background in her science fiction, like Song for a New Day really drew on that. And this one really worked for me. I loved that she wrote a new murder ballad. I have a little bit of experience with the child ballads through a songwriting class that I took where the instructor was really into them, and I totally bought this as one of those ballads. And so I just, the way it was structured with the unfolding through the comments, really clever. I agree it was supposed to be horror, but it also reminded me a bit of the Pequeninos in Speaker for the Dead.
Yeah.
That they maybe there was some sort of misunderstanding between species here, and this girl wasn't necessarily intending anything sinister, but kind of didn't get how people physically worked.
Right.
So the planting of, planting people.
Yes, exactly. That's what I was thinking. Rob, go ahead.
Okay, well, yeah, similar to, it's interesting. I was going to say it first, but Sarah beat me to it, that just between just the formal inventiveness of this, structured as a wiki discussion of a folk song, and the fact that it's about music. And I'm one of those people who has worked in record stores, pretty much for the purpose of getting the employee discount. To feed my habit. So as she said, this is my jam. So I really bonded with this one a lot, and it's got some of the best use of footnotes by anyone who's not named Terry Pratchett, and I like the way it was structured in the form of a discussion, and the idea that there were stories within stories, that there was this one guy, for instance, whose comments were always dinged by this one other guy, and in fact they start kind of tussling over that within the story itself. It's a side story, but it adds a little texture to the whole thing. And the one thing I kind of wonder about it is, does anyone else notice that something funky is going on within this? That the song might be referencing something real and ongoing in it. But other than that, I really enjoyed just reading this a lot.
Yeah. Anne had asked in the chat if there was if there was a link to Sarah Pinsker singing this, and there is actually in the story. There's the only live link that I think is in there is in the story. It lists, like the Barbra Streisand version of it, or the cover from no, it's Dolly Parton. That's right. The only live link actually goes to a YouTube where I believe it's Sarah Pinsker singing it there, but I'm not sure. Cora says yes, so I believe you, Cora. Why don't you go ahead and go next?
Mm-hmm. Well, I also enjoyed, first of all, the unusual format. We've had quite a few stories in recent years playing with form. Of course, we also have Unknown Number on the same ballot. And we had A Guide to Working Breeds, which was another chat story last year. And we had, I've forgotten the name, it was by Sarah Gailey about it was a paper about a self-driving car and an accident which killed a child, an academic paper and the editing notes. And I wish I could remember the name of the story now, but it was also so stories playing with form is definitely a thing right now, and one I enjoy. And of course, few people do better than Sarah Pinsker is understated, subtle horror. Her story last year was also just very, very understated, subtle horror in the background. It's not in your face horror. Actually, The Sins of America, which isn't supposed to be a horror story as far as I think, is a lot more in your face, terrible and horrible than this one. This is just creepy. Also about ballads actually were a news medium, which is why a lot of them are based on real cases. Because traveling balladeers, they traveled from town to town. Often they had pictures. At least this is how it worked in Germany. And I suppose it would have been similar in the UK. This is also from the British-Irish ballad tradition, but the traditions were similar. They had pictures. They showed. So they called Bänkelsänger in Germany because they had a small wooden bench. They stood on a bench and they had a kind of a row of like a primitive comic strip pictures, and then they showed it a picture and sang their song. And this format was still done. We have photos actually of people doing this. So this was still done in the early 20th century. What killed this wandering balladeer tradition sort of was the Nazis, because the Nazis don't like itinerant people. Of course, oh God, they could be Romani or something. And also they don't really like uncontrollable singers making possibly political comments about current events, because these songs often are political. And interestingly, there was a revival of this tradition, which was very much political, in the 1950s. There are a couple of West German movies from the 1950s where a ballad is used as a sort of commentary on the story and also to tell the stories. We get the different verses. One of the best is the Spessart Inn, which is it's a wonderful historical fantasy movie. If you're not that familiar with West German history, post-war history, and if you're familiar, it's even better. I think it's whole on YouTube, unfortunately only in German, but it's great. And it starts, and there's a wandering balladeer with a dancing bear who tells the story. And there's a couple of other movies which used it. Some of them very, very harshly satirical. What's it called? The Girl Rosemary, which is a story, which is actually also about a true case, a spectacular murder case. A high-class prostitute was murdered sometime in the 1950s, and she had lots of high-class clients, and the case was never solved. But one of the high-class clients obviously did it. And they made a movie about this also with a team of balladeers commenting on the story. And there's another one. It's sort of this style of storytelling. Actually, it was quite common. It was revived in the 1950s, and then it died out simply because the people who played the wandering balladeers were always the same two guys, and one of them died. There was some kind of comedy or satire. They were not really comedy. It was more cabaret. So it was more political. They were political comedians. And yeah, so there is an old tradition here. Here, a lot of these ballads are based on real cases, but often we don't really know what the real case was because files have been lost, or also ballads changed, texts have been misunderstood. So yes, this is something I really enjoyed from this background. And of course, also there is obviously real supernatural thing happening here. We're not entirely sure if it's malicious or if the girl with the oaken heart simply has no idea how people work, or if she's actually trying to reproduce. I mean, apparently she is trying to reproduce what she's doing, planting acorns and oak trees in people's hearts is apparently some kind of reproduction, which goes horribly wrong. So yes, it's a really well done story.
Yeah. Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, so to talk a little more about the magic that's going on, the idea of taking the heart from someone who is, well, they agree, even if maybe they didn't really understand what they were agreeing to. So, you know, Fair Ellen, the song, supernatural person, takes this person's heart who thought he went off for a nice little, you know, frolic in the woods with a pretty girl, and she ends up taking his heart and putting it in the ancient, maybe the ancient tree. It's you know, a lot of folk tales, you don't always understand what the reference is. Maybe the people at the time did, but you can make all these guesses, and that's what is part of what's going on in the thread. But she takes this guy's heart. He goes back to his village. They can all tell he's no longer maybe he no longer has a soul. Not sure, but the village can tell, well, this guy's gone. He can't talk. He's a goner. We better hang him because what we have in front of us is a dead man walking. That's the way I interpreted what happened. Mm-hmm. You can read it different ways. And so the idea of taking a heart and putting it in trees, maybe, for them to live, and then the villagers go off and start burning down all the trees and so on, but the trees keep coming back. So anyway, there's such interesting stuff. I just loved that tree supernatural magic part of it. So that to me was, I think, just the fascination of what exactly is going on here is part of what the appeal was for me.
Yeah, I think most of the times when you hear about cases like this where there's, you know, suspected magic or something, it always ends up with women being killed in the real world. So here it was one case where a man died for it. Amanda, go ahead.
Yeah, just following on the theme of the magic, I think it's worth noting that we have 2 short stories that include a dryad this year, so that's kind of fun. Mm-hmm. And then switching gears completely, in architecture, there's this concept of a living building that if you construct a building appropriately, it'll grow as the needs of its occupants demand. And I couldn't help thinking that that's true of stories, and that, you know, reflecting on and retelling stories in different ways, taking those old murder ballads and kind of reinterpreting them, repurposing them in this way, is just something worth noting. That's all, that it's a living story, and that there's a social construction to it that's emergent and dynamic, and that was really neatly done in an atypical format that my read of it is relied on a narrative nesting of sorts. So yeah, just some food for thought.
Cora, follow up.
Well, about what Sarah just said about folk tales and fairy tales in the different versions, a lot of fairy tales, for example, many of the Grimm's fairy tales, or also of other collections, fairy tales were cautionary tales, right. Tales told to children and young women. I mean, it's a very, very common fairy tale motive. It's Rumpelstiltskin and the seven brothers and lots of others. Oh yes, Mary's Child, which is one of the worst, I think. There's a really common fairy tale motive, for example, about a girl who's in some kind of supernatural trouble, often can't talk. She marries a prince or a king and has a child, and the child is stolen by some kind of supernatural entity like Rumpelstiltskin, or in this Mary's Child, it's actually the Virgin Mary stealing the children. Yeah, the Virgin Mary goes stealing children, and this was an actual fairy tale. And then the woman is almost burnt at the stake, and at the last moment, everything comes clear that she did not, because she's believed having killed her child. Now, a lot of women were convicted of infanticide and killing their children. Sometimes there were often young women who had children out of wedlock. Sometimes they probably did kill them. Sometimes the children were just stillbirths or died of sudden infant death syndrome, or the girl panicked and put her child somewhere in the woods where died. And those women were often they were actually burnt at the stake, and this was still done and now after a while they stopped burning them at the stake and started beheading them, at least in Germany, and hanging in the UK. But women were still executed for supposed or a real infanticide well into the 19th century. And this is very much those fairy tales like Rumpelstiltskin. It's a cautionary tale. It's basically telling, okay, girl, if there's this guy and if you have a kid with him and the baby dies, they will all blame you. No matter who actually did it, if it wasn't Virgin Mary or Rumpelstiltskin, you will be the one who ends up burnt at the stake. And of course, Little Red Riding Hood is another great example. It's basically a cautionary tale of don't talk to the handsome guy you meet in the woods because he might be a wolf. Of course, not a literal wolf in this case. It might be it's in this case just a guy, of course. And all those evil step parents are of course also another thing because in times when both maternal mortality and was high, a lot of people had step parents and children had step parents, and with lots of children to feed, step parents often did not particularly care about the stepchild and try to get rid of it. So those are all cautionary tales, and this ballad is also sort of cautionary tale, like okay, if you meet the handsome dryad in the woods and she tells she's going to take your heart, she may well literally take your heart.
Yeah. Sarah, go ahead.
One little thing that I think Pinsker did deliberately, while reading through the story, I wanted to go to that edit page and add a comment, because there's several times where characters say, fair Ellen. She's not being fair. Why do they keep calling her fair? And I just wanted to reach into that story and say, look, fair means blonde in some context. Don't you get it? They're just saying she was blonde. They weren't saying she was a nice, fair person. And I think that Pinsker put that in deliberately because it makes me want to edit the page. And so it makes the whole, I have edited Wikipedia pages before, I have seen edit wars going on in Wikipedia. I want to edit those, to add a comment to explain to the people in the story who don't understand what fair Ellen means, and nobody's correcting them. So are the people who are clearly more knowledgeable just ignoring the people who keep asking about fair Ellen, or is actually everybody interested in different stuff and so nobody I don't know. That just made it all so real to me, because I've seen so many talk pages on Wikipedia where some people just clearly don't get it, that just really made it come alive for me. That little leaving a little flaw in the comments just makes it so real to me. I also wanted to mention Sarah Pinsker was in a panel about murder ballads, I think it was, at Worldcon. And I did participate, as just an attendee, in chat and so on. And then in the Discord later, I told her about the Library of Congress, that the Folk Life Today has an episode specifically on murder ballads. And so she was pleased to hear that and to get the link from me. And so I was pleased with that. And I hadn't even read this story yet. I just thought, oh, cool. Another SF geek who knows a little about these folk songs and so on.
Yeah. Any other comments on this one? Or we can kind of move into wrapping up. Does anybody want to talk about what your favorites were? Because kind of as I was going to invite people to make opening statements at the beginning, but since I didn't do that, if you want to make a closing statement, about what your favorite is or favorite couple, you can go ahead and do that. Anybody who wants to can just unmute and go for it.
I'll jump in. I am rooting for, as it was probably clear when I was talking about it, I'm rooting for Unknown Number by Blue Neustifter. That's going to be my number one. And actually my ratings, I've been sitting here actually editing my ratings a little bit as we're talking, because it's some, things that other people brought to light did influence my thinking. And but yes, that's was already and has stayed my number one. And Where Oaken Hearts Do Gather actually went up to number 2 during this discussion.
Nice. Yeah, same thing's been happening on my tablet here as we've been talking. Anybody else want to show your hand prior to voting? Go ahead, Cora.
Well, I think my favorite is still Mr. Death, but in general, this is a very, very strong ballad. Short story. There's not a bad one among them. In a weekly year, every single one of them could have, and even this year, every single one of them would be a worthy winner. There's not a bad story, and it's really difficult to decide also how to rank them. I'm having a similar problem also in novel, which is also very strong, that they are basically, I know which one I will put in the bottom spots, but the top 4 keep changing around. And here it's even more similar, because I'm basically mixing all of them. I think I probably know the bottom 2, but the top 4 keep changing around, because it's an extremely strong ballad this year.
Yeah. Sarah, what about you?
So I feel like last year's short story category finalists were stronger than this year. I didn't love a lot of stories that other people in this discussion clearly loved. And last year I had such a hard time ranking them, and this year it was easier for me. So I'll just read off what I have. I have Where Oaken Hearts Do Gather, people may have guessed, as my number 1. Then Tangles, then The Sin of America, then Mr. Death, then Proof by Induction, then Unknown Number. Like some people have commented in chat, I definitely appreciate the discussion, because it does make me see things in the story that I either had missed or just hadn't really thought about those angles before. And I know my choices are different from some of the people who are voting, but that's how it stacks up for me. As I mentioned, I had a hard time reading the Valente, but just someone else mentioned her prose. It's so powerful, but I just like the other 2 that I mentioned a little bit better. So that's why we have these discussions.
Yeah, definitely. Go ahead, Haley.
Yeah, I think Unknown Number and Mr. Death are probably at the top of my list. I personally loved Unknown Number, but I think Mr. Death is just 100% bulletproof. It's just like super strong. At the bottom, this will be no surprise to Lori or anybody that listens to Hugo Girl. We have a segment that we end each episode with is this work more Star Wars or more Lord of the Rings? And I'm a notorious fantasy hater, so I could not get through Tangle. I know it's probably great, and I think it's cool that y'all pointed out the cool stuff about teamwork, and I just can't read fantasy. So, which is a fault on my part, and I'm trying. But yeah, that'll be towards the bottom of my list for sure.
Nice. Anybody else? It's an optional part of the podcast.
Well, let's see. It is going to be, I really am going to have to reread all of these again before settling on a final order. At this point, tentatively, I have Mr. Death and Proof by Induction and Unknown Number all kind of vying for number 1, but I could see either Sin of America or Where Oaken Hearts Do Gather getting up into that group as well. Neither of them hit me quite as hard or as immediately as those first 3 did, but it could be that a reread would strike deeper for me. And some of the people who argued for Tangles in this makes me want to take another look at that as well. I admire a lot, there's other Shannon McGuire writing I like that has hit me somewhat harder. I'm really enjoying her Wayward Children series, for instance. So that will probably rank higher on my own ballot in novellas than Tangle will on short stories, but I will, give it another chance for sure. And I'm looking forward to making my final decision. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah. Well, we won't hold anybody to what they ranked on this episode. Ivor, go ahead.
As I say, I'm just a reader, so I'm looking at this a different way. I agree with Sarah. I don't think this year is as strong, but I would say there is a theme, or a theme to me as a reader, that at least three of them. So it's like Sins of America, Tangles, and where Oaken Hearts Gather. They don't seem to be what you expect from the beginning. You start at the beginning thinking, oh, I know where this might be going, and then halfway through, it's very much, oh, good plot move, good plot shift, good writing has meant that it actually gives you something more to think about, and you can more engage in different ways. Although with Tangles possibly might be more, say, the fantastical level, but the others did have that horror feel. There was something more engaging with them as you went on, which maybe last you didn't have. It was very upfront. You know what was coming, but you still enjoyed it, and it feels stronger.
Yeah. I may try to track down some of the audio versions of some of these, because I read all of these ones just from the material that was put into the packet this year. So I may try and follow up on a couple of these and kind of take them in again. At the moment, Where Oaken Hearts Do Gather is my favorite, just because I love the playing with the medium that is done there, and just the kind of unfolding mystery to it that has several layers where you can easily miss something that was going on in there if you're not into it. But I understand it would be an easy one to bounce off of too. Final thoughts from anybody else? Otherwise, we can go around, and if folks want to say where people can contact you if they want to, we can do that.
I just wanted to say I'm surprised you haven't heard the audio versions of these stories, since you have dogs to walk.
I do have dogs to walk, but at the moment our son's home from college, so we usually have him there for audio entertainment. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for doing this. I really appreciate it. It's pretty short notice. I know it was, kind of, I've been hinting that I was going to do this for a long time, but it really only coalesced like over the last week. So thank you for being willing to do this. And thanks, Juan, for setting up the Zoom call for us. So does anybody want to plug something? I know, Anne, you should mention your podcast, and you're part of the Hugo collective of podcasts.
Thank you very much for having me. My sister Alice and I do the Hugo and Nebula Readership podcast, and I've enjoyed this very much. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming. And yeah, I want to direct people over there, and y'all are going through in order, which can be a lot.
It has been a lot. It's been quite an eye-opening experience to read them from the beginning.
Yeah.
Going through in historical order has been an eye-opener. Yes, that is probably the most polite word I could use.
Yes, listening to y'all dealing with, reading through in order kind of retroactively justifies my choice to not do it that way. I'm glad I went in more scattershot order.
Yes,
so,
yes.
Yeah. Juan, do you have any contact info you want to give out?
Oh yeah, I'm on Twitter as Rainbow War 71. I'm usually out and about. If anybody does go to Worldcon, say hi to me, even if I'm in a conversation. Just tap me when I'm done.
Cool. Amanda.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so you can check out the Hugo Book Club blog at the URL I just threw into the chat. We're also on Twitter at Hugo Book Club, and just a heads up that my partner Olav Rockney is the Twitter guy. So if you're seeing any reference to me, that's not me or I. But we do chat about things, especially when he gets in trouble.
Nice. All right, what about you, Rob? Maybe we'll go to Lisa next. You're still on mute, Rob.
Okay. Yeah. I don't have anything particular to plug. I'm just, on Twitter under my own name these days, and discuss science fiction, music, movies, sometimes current events. But I'm hoping to look up. I follow some of y'all on Twitter, and looking forward to catching up with everybody else too.
Cool. Lisa, go ahead.
Sure. So I am part of the Narrated podcast. It is about audiobooks, has a heavy focus on science fiction and fantasy. You can find us on any place where podcasts are hosted. You can also find us on Twitter @_narrated. That account is run by Scott Ullery, who says hello, by the way, and is who has also been a guest on Hugo's There.
Yeah.
And then I'm also personally on Twitter @Lisa_JM.
Cool. All right. How about Lori next?
Yeah, you can find us at Hugo Girl Podcast on all social media. I do the tweeting, so any bad takes or anything like that are all my responsibility, should not be put on Haley or Amy or Kevin. We're also on Instagram and on Facebook, but less so. And then our website is hugogirlpodcast.com, where you can find a schedule of our upcoming episodes, transcripts of our episodes. So there's some additional information that people might want to check out there. Thanks.
Right. And reminder to anybody watching or listening to this that Amanda and Olav are on the ballot for fanzine. So make sure to check out. It's just fantastic writing over there. So throw a vote their way if you're a voting member this way. Hugo Girl is also on the ballot. Make sure to vote for them and for Cora as well. So before we get around to her, Ivor, did you have any contact info you wanted to give out?
No, I'm just a reader, but if anybody wants me to go and read something and have some feedback, I'll be more than happy. It's a distraction from the day job.
All right.
This has been great.
Yeah, thanks for coming. I appreciate it. What about you, Sarah?
Mainly @configures on Twitter. Email and Facebook too, but those are more locked down. But anybody can say hey on Twitter.
Okay. And Cora?
You can find my blog at corabullert.com. That's CORABUHLERT.com. And you can find me on Twitter at corabullert, again CORABUHLERT. And you can find links to my stories and books and so on via my blog. I also occasionally blog on Galactic Journey, which is a fanzine and also best fanzine finalist this year. And we're like a regular fanzine, except we talk about science fiction magazines, novels, movies, except that we do it 55 years in the past. So now it's 1967. It's a summer of love, which in Germany was not very lovely because lots of terrible things happened. And finally, also, because a lot of people who will be listening to this are Hugo voters. If you are a Hugo voter, please do not neglect the fan categories, because there are a lot of great people in the fan categories. We have several of them on this panel. We have Amanda and we have Laurie and Haley, and you don't have to vote for one of us, but please don't neglect the fan categories, because we've got a lot of great people there, and they get often very low vote counts to the point that the categories are actively endangered. So please check out the voter packets for the fan finalists, or check out their blogs or podcasts or Twitter feeds, and just don't ignore the categories. It's not, the Hugos are also about the fans, and not just about movies and stories and novels.
Yeah. Haley, I skipped you, but I assumed that Lori already gave your details. If you have anything else, go ahead and chime in.
Yeah, I'm not really on Twitter, but I'm very active on Instagram, and not necessarily with sci-fi, but I really like cats and gardening and food and all things nautical. So I'll drop that link if people
Do you
are
ever
interested.
post any Lord of the Rings hate on there just randomly?
No, I mean,
Save that for the
I
pod.
try not to be too vocal in my dislike of it because I know how many people love it. But yeah.
Yeah. All right, JW.
Yep, I can be found on Twitter at JWWartic and also on my blog, eclectic.theist.wordpress.com, which I'll link in here. Just talking about sci-fi, fantasy, baseball, anything that comes across my mind. So thank you.
I'll make sure to gather up all the links and put them in the show notes or video description, that kind of stuff. So again, thank you so much, everybody, for doing this. I really appreciate it. I'll try and get this turned around pretty quick and post it on the interwebs for video and audio. Yeah, very much appreciate this. I love being able to engage my circle of internet friends and meet new people. That's awesome. Oh, and I guess you can find, I'm on Twitter at Hugo's Podcast. That's where I do most of my tweeting. I think last time somebody said, hey, you didn't do your own. So I suppose I should plug it. I assume if you found this, you've already found me on the interwebs. So thank you. And bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
I'll go ahead and hit stop here.